Now today we're going to do lesson 9.4. And before we get into the lesson, I want to review a little bit what we've done already in this chapter. Okay? In 9.2, we learned how to solve quadratic equations by graphing. Now, what were you looking for on the graph in order to give the solution? Loza? The x-intercepts, all right? Very good. Now, I'm really sad because a bunch of you missed that on yesterday's quiz. There was a question. It was already graphed for you. You literally had to go onto the graph, find the x-intercepts, and tell me x equals this and x equals that. Some of you did all this extra work, and I'm not really sure why, because all you had to do was pull the x-intercepts off the graph, okay? We also learned in 9.3 how to solve quadratic equations by square roots, okay, or with square roots. Now, think back to that for just a second. If you can think back to yesterday's quiz, the last two questions on the quiz, how many variables were in those problems? When we were able to solve the equations by using square roots, how many x's were in the problem? One. And it was x to what power? To the second power. Okay, so we talked about how solving with square roots only works if there's an x squared term and a constant. Okay, but what happens today when the x comes back into play? What happens when we're once again looking at trinomials? Well, now we have to solve these quadratic equations by completing the square. And I want you just to notice the difference. Okay, 9.3, we solved quadratic equations using square roots. Today we're solving quadratic equations by completing the square. Now, the good news is you're going to see a lot of familiar things as we do this. A lot of things that we have already done in the past, we're going to use and piece together to complete the square. So the essential question for today, how can you use completing the square to solve a quadratic equation? Now, let's start with the simplest part of this process. The steps to completing the square for the expression x squared plus bx. So you can see right there that not only is the x squared in the problem, which is what makes these problems quadratic, but now x is back in play. There's an x squared and there's an x. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to add a plus sign and a blank. Okay? We are going to figure out the constant for this problem. We're going to do that by taking b divided by 2 and squaring that number that we find. Now, let's talk about b. Okay? What is b in our formula? If we look back here at our formula, what does b represent? The coefficient of x. Exactly. All right? So we're going to take the coefficient of x every single time. We're going to divide by 2, and then we're going to square that number. And that is the number that we're going to add to the expression. All right? So let's try this. In example 1, it says complete the square for the expression, then factor the trinomial. There's our favorite word, factor. Remember I told you we were going to keep factoring and keep factoring. So here we are again. But let's start with finding that constant. So first thing we wrote down is that we're going to add a plus sign and we're going to add a blank. So let's everybody do that. Now we're supposed to take b and divide it by 2. What is, Layla, what's the b value in this problem? 10. So we're going to take right below this problem, we're going to take 10. We're going to divide it by 2. And everyone, what is 10 divided by 2?
5.
Awesome, 5. We're then supposed to square that number. So I'm going to put that number in parentheses and I'm going to square it. What is 5 squared?
25.
So 25 is the constant and it goes on the line. Now, we're supposed to factor this. So let's go all the way back to factoring and let's ask ourselves the first question. Is there a GCF? No, there is not. Okay, the leading coefficient is a 1. There is no GCF. All right. Question number 2. What type of a polynomial are we dealing with? A trinomial. And question number 3, is there a shortcut? Well, if this is a trinomial, there's only one possible shortcut. It is a perfect square trinomial. And guess what? Every single time we do this, we are creating a perfect square trinomial. We don't have to question it. We don't even have to check 2ab to make sure. If we have taken b, divided it by 2, and squared it, we have created a perfect square trinomial. So, for me, if I'm you, underneath factoring, I'm letting myself know it's a PST. Okay, if you need to write out perfect square trinomial, go for it. But it's going to be, if I've done it correctly, it's a perfect square trinomial every single time. So let's review how we can very, very quickly factor a perfect square trinomial. First of all, how many parentheses are there in my answer? 1. And it's raised to the second power. All right, what's the sign in my answer always going to be? Nope, not the first sign in the original problem. So for letter A, the first sign in the problem is a plus. So we're going to bring down the plus. And then how do we find, somebody raise your hand, how do we find the terms that go in our answer? Travis?
Square the first term and the last.
Square the first term and square the third term. Now, again, if you need to remind yourself of that, go ahead and put the little square roots over the first and third terms. Okay? If you can remember it, then don't worry about that part. But it's taking the square root of the first term and the third term. So, what's the square root of x squared?
X.
Every time. And what is the square root of 25? 5. And we're done. Now, let's try it again on letter B. First thing we do, we add a plus sign and we add a line. What is the B value this time that we are going to divide by 2? -4. So everybody write -4 divided by 2. And what does that equal? -2. I'm going to put it in parentheses and I'm supposed to square it. Well, what's the square? Oh, it's -2 squared. 4. So 4 is going to go in my blank. Now, I'm supposed to factor it. How many parentheses? 1 raised to the second power. Let's bring the sign. What's the sign of our answer going to be? Negative, the first sign in the original problem. And Deslin, what are my terms going to be this time? X minus 2. And there's my factored answer. All right, take about 30 seconds and I want you to work letter C. And listen, leave it improper. If it's a fraction and it's simplified, you can leave it improper. Okay, I don't want any decimal answers on letter C. Letter C, what is the B value that we're dividing this time? 7. So we're doing 7 divided by 2. Can we do anything with that? Is that going to come out to be a whole number? No, so we're going to leave it improper and we're going to go ahead and square it. So after we add our plus sign and our blank, what are we filling in that blank with? What's 7 halves squared? 49/4. All right, awesome. So let's factor it. We've got how many sets of parentheses? 1 raised to the second power. The sign Chase, and our answer is going to be what? Plus. And our terms are going to be?
X and
7/2. Awesome. Now, does anybody notice, if you look at all 3 of these problems, does anybody notice anything about our factored answer and the step right above it? Avery.
You can get your second variable from after doing b divided by 2.
Okay, the number that you got when you divided b by 2 is always the term that's in your answer. Okay, so that is something to recognize. If you can recognize that and speed your process up a little bit, great. Otherwise, just keep taking the square root of the first term and the square root of the third term and making those the terms of your answer. Now, is everybody with me so far? All right. So that takes us into completing the square, or steps to solving quadratic equations by completing the square. All right. So we wrote these steps down. Now, here's the thing I want you to understand. These steps are on the flow chart that we're about to look at. Okay. However, I know some of you, like me, like all your steps in a row, so it's easier for you to study. So that's why I had you write these steps down, and they're on the flow chart. All right. So they're in 2 separate places. But real quick, I want you to notice there's 2 questions that we have to ask ourselves before we start the process. Number 1 is the constant on the right side of the equation. Now, here's what we've been used to so far. Everything's on one side before we can start, right? We've had to make sure everything was on one side. It was set equal to 0. But completing the square is different. We actually want the constant alone. So we want the x's on one side of the problem. We want the constant alone on the other. So that's the first thing we have to make sure is happening. Secondly, is the leading coefficient a 1? Because if it's not, we have to divide everything by the leading coefficient before we can start. But look at step number 1. Once we've made sure the constant is alone, once we have made sure our leading coefficient is 1, look at our first step. It is exactly what we just did. We're going to add a plus sign and a line, but this time we're going to do it on both sides because it's an equation, and what you do to one side, you have to do the other. Okay? Look at step 2. Find b divided by 2 and square the number. We just did that. Step 3, add the number to both sides of the equation. We just did that. Factor the left side of the equation, which is going to be a perfect square trinomial. We just did that. And lastly, we're going to solve the equation for x using square roots. You did that yesterday on your quiz. That is 9.3 right there for your last step. Okay? So I want you to see pretty much everything in this list we have done. So now it's just putting it all together. So let's look at example 2. And I want you to notice it says, solve the equation by completing the square. Round your solutions to the nearest hundredth if necessary. So we're not going to have to do upside down division. We're actually going to be able to give decimal answers if we have to. So turn those notebooks sideways and let's follow the flow chart. If you look at letter A, x squared minus 2x equals 3. Look at the writing underneath it. It says, look at your equation. Are the x squareds and the x's on the same side of the equation and the constant on the other? So answer that question. Are the x's on one side and the constant on the other? Yes. Yes. So we get to follow the arrow that says yes. That takes us to step number 2. What is, or determine, a, which is the leading coefficient. So looking at your problem, what is the leading coefficient? 1. All right, very good. So we're going to fill in that blank. Now, right under the line, you see what it says? Is it positive 1? Is it? Yes. Yes. So we get to follow the arrow that says yes, and we get to go to step 3. It says rewrite your equation, but add a blank space to each side. So there's step 3. So we're writing x squared minus 2x plus a blank equals 3 plus a blank. So this is exactly what we just did in example 1, except now we have to do it on both sides of the equation. All right, now follow the arrow to step 4. Here's where we're calculating b divided by 2. We're squaring it, and we're getting our number. So what is b for this particular problem?
2.
Careful. Negative 2. So we're filling in a negative 2. What is negative 2 divided by 2? Negative 1, which is now in parentheses. And when we square negative 1, what do we get? 1. Now follow the arrow. Do you see the arrow? We're not going down. Remember, we're going up and to the right. We're going to step number 5. What does step number 5 say? It says add the final number from the box into both blanks. So basically the number we just found is going into our blanks. So we have x squared minus 2x plus 1, and it equals 3 plus 1. Now follow the arrow to step 6. Rewrite the quadratic equation as x plus b divided by 2 squared. So basically what are we doing? We're factoring, right? We're factoring the trinomial. All right? So just worry about, remember, we're just factoring the trinomial. Don't worry about the 3 plus 1 yet. We'll get to that in just a second. Okay? Jaden, when we factor this, how many sets of parentheses are going to be in our answer? And it's going to be raised to what power? Okay. What's the sign going to be? Good. First sign in the problem is negative, so we bring it down. And what will our terms be, Jaden? We take the square root of the first term, the square root of the third term, and we get x minus 1. Now, bring down the rest of the problem, which is equals, what's 3 plus 1? Everybody? 4. Good. Now, do you see a problem like you had on yesterday's quiz? The squared part of the problem is isolated, and we are supposed to solve for x. So how do we undo something that has been squared? Square root it. And look at step 7 on your flow chart. It says square root both sides. So we are going to, in the box above, we're going to draw our little square root symbol. And remember, we put the radical into the problem. So what else has to go into the problem? That plus or minus symbol. Okay? What is the square root of x minus 1 squared? X minus 1, and it equals plus or minus. What is the square root of 4? 2. Now you'll notice I left a little space because we've got to finish solving for x, and we're putting our answer in that last box. Okay? So how am I going to solve for x? I'm going to add 1. Now remember, I showed you this right before the quiz yesterday. You could rewrite this as x minus 1 equals 2 and x minus 1 equals negative 2. Okay, if you struggle to solve both equations, then you can write them separate. All right, but for now, we're going to leave them like this. So our first x value is going to equal what? 3. We've got a positive 2 plus 1, which is 3. And the second equation, it's negative 2 plus 1. So our answer is negative 1. And there are our two answers. Let's look at letter B. First thing we're asking ourselves, are in this case, the g's together on one side and the constant alone on the other? Yes or no?
No.
No. So follow the little arrow that says no. And what does it tell us to do? It says rewrite your equation. Rewrite your equation so that the x squared and the x terms are on one side of the equation. The constant, the number without a variable attached, is on the other side of the equation. And remember to combine like terms if necessary. So what number do we need to move to the other side? And how are we going to move it? So right up here in the box, just do minus 27 on both sides. And then we'll rewrite it as 3g squared minus 24g equals negative 27. All right, now we follow that arrow over to step 2. And what does it want us to do? Determine A. What is our A this time? 3. So we fill in that blank. Question, is it positive 1?
No.
So follow the no arrow. And what does it tell us to do? Divide your entire equation by A. So what is our A this time? 3. So I'm going to go up here in the box and I'm going to show that I'm dividing everything by 3, and then I'll write my new answer in this box. 3g squared divided by 3 is g squared. Minus, what's 24g divided by 3? 8g. And it's going to equal, what's negative 27 divided by 3? Negative 9. All right, now we follow the arrow over to step 3, and we are rewriting the equation, but adding a blank space to each side. So g squared minus 8g plus a blank equals negative 9 plus a blank. All right, let's fill in our numbers. What's our b this time? Negative 8. Blake, what's negative 8 divided by 2?
Negative 4.
And negative 4 squared?
2.
Negative 4 squared. You're not square rooting it, you're squaring it.
Negative 16.
Is it negative though? A negative 4 times a negative 4 is a positive 16. Good. We follow our arrow to step 5. We add the final number. So g squared minus 8g plus 16 equals negative 9 plus 16. All right. Step 6, we're factoring. JC, how many parentheses are in my final answer?
1.
Or in my factored answer? 1, and it's raised to the... Okay, what sign am I going to use this time? Look at the first sign in your problem.
Negative.
Negative. So we bring that sign down and it's negative. And what will the terms be?
X.
Careful. They're G's.
Oh, G.
G and...
16.
You got to take the square root. Don't just bring it. You're never going to just bring stuff straight down when you're factoring perfect square trinomials.
4.
Okay, so the first term is
X minus 4.
G
Johnson.
4. All right, so G minus 4 squared equals, what is negative 9 plus 16?
5.
Try again. It is 7. Negative 9 plus 16 is a positive 7. Now, step number 7 says to square root both sides. So we put the radical into the problem. What else has to go into the problem? Plus or minus. All right. So we're going to bring down, what is the square root of g minus 4 squared? Just g minus 4, and it equals plus or minus the square root of 7. Now we can't do anything with that. It's not a perfect square. But again, remember, round your solutions to the nearest hundredth. It told us that in the instructions. So decimal answers are going to be okay. How do we finish solving for g? We add 4 to both sides. Now your calculator is going to be real picky about this Okay, so in parentheses, I'm putting a parenthesis, I'm putting the square root button, the 7, and then you want to hit the arrow so it moves it out from under the radical before you close the parenthesis, and then we're adding 4. And you want a decimal answer, so if we're rounding to the nearest hundredth, that's how many decimal places? 2. Now, you see that I'm using a squiggly equal sign because that means approximately. These are not exact answers when we give decimal answers, so it's approximately. Okay, so one more time, in parentheses, you have to put the square root of 7, okay, then plus 4, and what does that give you? To the nearest hundredth, what does that give you? 6.65. Very good. Now, the second time through, it is what kind of a square root of 7? So be very careful. Parenthesis, the negative sign, the square root button, the 7, hit the arrow to get you out from under the radical, then close the parenthesis and add the 4. And what does that give you to the nearest hundredth? 1.35. So these are your final answers. Just remember to put the approximate sign and not just your equal sign. Now I want you to move on to letter C, and I want you with your table to start working this problem. First question, are your m's on one side and your constant on the other? Yes. All right, perfect. What is your leading coefficient? 1. Perfect. So we can go straight into what is our first step going to be? We got to add the what? The blanks. So we got m squared plus 12m plus your blank equals negative 8 plus your blank. How do we figure out what goes in the blank? Okay, the b value is 12 this time, so we divide it by 2, and that gives us 6. And we do what with that 6? We square it. What is 6 squared? 36. Awesome. Now we factor. How many sets of parentheses? Raised to the second power. What sign is in our answer? Plus, and our terms are the square root of m squared and the square root of 36 become m and 6. Perfect. We then bring down equals. What is negative 8 plus 36? 28. Awesome. Now we've got to finish. How do we solve for m?
You gotta square it.
You got to take the square root of both sides. Now, we put the radical into the problem. What else do we have to put in? Plus or minus. So the square root of m plus 6 squared is m plus 6, and it equals. Now, we get to leave this. We do not have to do upside down division. Since our answers are being rounded to the nearest decimal place, we can leave it as the square root of 28 and put that into our calculator. But how do we get m by itself? We've got to subtract 6. So again, we got to be real careful here. We've got the positive square root of 28 minus 6. And what does that give me as a decimal? Okay, don't forget it's an approximate sign, so it's negative 0.71. And m is approximately, the second time through, it is the negative square root of 28 minus 6. And somebody different, what do we get for that decimal? Negative 11.29. Awesome job, guys. Now, let's look at example number 3. It says, write the equation in vertex form by completing the square. So we're going to follow all the same steps, except at the end, we're not going to actually have to solve for x. We're going to get to stop. Because does anyone remember what vertex form looks like? Does anybody remember the formula? And listen, add this to your notes. It's f of x equals x minus h in parentheses squared plus k. Does everybody remember that? Okay, if not, that's okay. Write it down because we want our final answer to be in this form. Now, you see the little statement. It says leave y on this side with the constant and at the end solve for y. So we'll talk about that here in just a second. But leave y on the side with the constant. Remember, we need the constant away from the variables. So it's okay that there's going to be a y with it this time. So let me show you. What is the constant we need to move in letter A? We need to move 4. and we're going to subtract it from both sides. So everybody subtract it, and we're just keeping y minus 4 equals negative x squared minus 4x. Now, the leading coefficient, is it a 1? Is it a positive 1? No, it's a negative 1. So what do we have to do before we can move forward? Divide everything by negative 1. Remember, if the leading coefficient is not positive 1, we divide everything by the leading coefficient. So we have y plus 4 equals positive x squared plus 4x. Now we can move forward. So what do we add to the problem? The blanks. So y plus 4 plus our blank equals x squared plus 4x plus our blank. How do we figure out the number that goes in the blank? B, which is 4 divided by 2, which equals 2. And what do we do with the 2? Square it, and that gives me, so I put a 4 in both of my blanks. That means I have y plus 8 on the left side, and I'm going to factor the trinomial. How many sets of parentheses? Raise it to the second power. The sign is going to be positive, and the terms are going to be x plus 2. Very good. Remember, it's the square root of the first term and the square root of the third term. Now, at this point, we've been taking the square root of both sides, but we want our problem in vertex form. So the last thing we have to do is get y by itself. See where it says at the end, solve for y? What do we got to do to get y by itself? Subtract 8. So we subtract 8 from both sides. I can't combine it with anything on the right, so x plus 2 squared minus 8. Is that not vertex form? It is vertex form. Okay? Let's look at letter B. First question, is the constant away from the x's? So how do we move the constant away from the x's? We add 2. Remember, we're okay that it's with the y for right now. So y plus 2 equals x squared minus 2x. Second question, is the leading coefficient a positive 1? Yes. So we go straight into our steps. What is step number 1? Plus your blank. So y plus 2 plus your blank equals x squared minus 2x plus our blank. How are we going to figure out the blank this time? Okay, what is our b? Negative 2 divided by 2 is equal to? Negative 1. And what are we supposed to do with negative 1? Square it. All right, what is negative 1 squared? So add 1 to both blanks, and we have y plus 3 equals, what are we supposed to do with our trinomial? Factor it. How many sets of parentheses? Raise to second power. Our sign will be, and our terms will be the square root of x squared and the square root of 1. So that is x and 1. Now, remember, to finish this, we're not solving for x this time. We're solving for y. So what do I need to move so that y is by itself? I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. So y equals x minus 1 squared minus 3. Is that vertex form? 100%. Yes, and that is 9.4.